I have no doubt, and I'm saying this not lightly, because of Vishal's mindset, if you simply listen to Vishal's podcasts and if you simply tune in to Vishal, you're increasing the probability that you will successfully achieve that in the same way that going to the Berkshire Hathaway meeting increases that probability. But those kinds of small actions help. So.
Hello and welcome everyone. I am Vishal Khandelwal and this is the 1% Show. This show is an open-ended exploration into the minds of the wisest people around to help us learn to think, invest and live each day as little as 1% better. You can learn more at vishalkhandelwal.com. My guest today is Guy Spier, founder and investment manager at Aquamarine Capital and author of The Education of a Value Investor, which is one of the best books I have read about someone's personal journey in life, business and investing. Guy founded Aquamarine in 1997 with capital from family and friends, and its investment philosophy was inspired by the original 1950s partnership of Warren Buffett. In fact, in 2007, Guy won a bid for US $650,000 with Monish Pabrai, whom I had interviewed in the fourth episode of the show for a charity lunch with Warren Buffett. Guy has an MBA from Harvard Business School and holds a first class degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University. With this and no further delay, Guy, welcome to the 1% Show. Thank you so much for
Vishal,
agreeing to do this.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for welcoming me and thanks for that kind introduction. I hear we're going to talk to somebody who's got a lot of wisdom, so I'm wondering who else you're going to have on the show,
Yeah. So this is the third time that we are talking, so you know what kind of wisdom you have. And just love to host you on the show again and again. So thank you so much for being there.
We, for the listeners' interest or the viewers' interest, we were just reviewing all the videos, and Sarah Mukherjee, you're the star. Everybody wants to hear you, but I guess you can't always appear on this show. So Vishal has to make do with me. But Sarah, I'm sending you warm wishes.
Thanks, Guy. Again, thank you so much. So, Guy, I'd love to start this session digging into the importance you lay on owning stocks for the long term. And for the audience, right, this is the third time we're talking on this show. And in the first two episodes, Guy shared his insights and lessons on life and living a good life, right? This session is purely about investing. So my first question to you guys about the importance that you lay on owning stocks for the long term. In fact, I just published a post on my site saying how long-term investing is hard because it flies in the face of anything taught in business schools. That is short-termism, and that it requires a painful degree of patience because it is only over long periods of time that the market eventually gravitates to value, right? So there's a lot going on over a very long period of time. That's a concern that most people have, right? It's largely unpredictable, the future, especially in the long term. You don't know what's going to happen in the world. There's a lot of unpredictability, and it gets injected in you if you're talking about a 20, 30-year time horizon. So how do you deal with that amount of uncertainty, and what are the benefits of having that short sort of long-term orientation that you work with?
I mean, so one thing is that, so it's not as if I was always that way. I think many people start, I remember not investing enough and then trading out too quickly because we feel like there's this bias towards action. But something that I've learned actually only in the last 2 or 3 years is that if you have a long-term horizon, then you actually have to do less work, frees up so much brain cells, and we're not aware that every time we start, if the decision comes up in my mind, should I buy, sell, hold, add to a position, that creates an enormous amount of mental work. And if you take that away, if you just say, I'm not going to think about this more frequently than once a month or once every 6 months, and actually I'm not going to think about selling unless these following conditions arise, then you're actually free to do a lot of other things. And I've learned that the stocks don't know that you own them, and what they're going to do, the way the business is going to unfold is the way the business is going to unfold, whether you think about every minute or not. And so it's just a better way to live, basically. And I'm not even sure if I'm connecting to your question, but all the benefits, the vast majority of the benefits from investing happen through compounding, and the best benefits on a pure dollar or a pure rupee sense happen when you've already compounded for a while. It's all about longevity. It's all about asking yourself, how can I do what I'm doing for a very, 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 very long time? And so I think that a question that I know Warren asks himself is, if I take this action that I'm doing right now and I repeat it over a lifetime, is that going to add or detract from my life, my capacity to invest well? And the minute you start looking at things in that perspective, there are many things you just say, well, if I no. And there are many things that I think, and I still do a lot, but I think I'm getting better, where the compromise is, well, I'll do this just once, or I'll do this just today. And the minute one kind of has this perspective of, well, assume that every action that you take, everything that you do is actually a vote for who you want to be for the rest of your life. And then see them with that perspective. There are many things that just disappear. And then life becomes a lot more simple. So I think that you can only do that if you restrict yourself to companies that are on long-term appreciation curves. So there are many companies, industries, countries, places where I just wouldn't invest because it doesn't allow me to think that way. So I think that if you're a listener and you're like, this does not apply to me, it may well not. If you're an oil trader or if you're a trader in one of the commodity pits, I'm not sure they exist anymore, but in places like Chicago, there used to be these commodity pits where traders would yell and scream at each other. That's not a place to sort of say, well, I need to think long term, because you're in a set of circumstances that in which you absolutely positively do not want to think long term. So thinking long term requires you first to maneuver yourself into a place where that is even possible. And that's got to do with not just one's own mentality, but it's also got to do with what kind of vehicle you're running, what kind of investments you've made, what your relationship to your partners is, all sorts of things like that. So, and one more thing, I see Vishal is nodding. I'm not sure if that's just Vishal being polite or if that means continue. But I would tell you that I run an investment partnership where it's people have the ability to call their money back from me at times when they want to, and there are rules as to how they can do that. But that's a different vehicle to permanent capital. And I can say that every now and then, especially when people get fearful, that becomes a constraint on my capacity to think long term, because I feel I've got investors who are suddenly worried about the value of their account, and they suddenly investor time horizons are getting foreshortened, which they have been in Western capital markets. Then it's harder to think long term. So I think that one other thing before I toss this back to you is that uh, if you're kind of like somebody, maybe you're in the audience and you're saying, I really want to think long term, longer term than I am thinking, because I know it's the right thing to do. What I urge you to consider is don't focus so much on what on your mind as focus on your environment, because if you're in the right environment, the long term will come in and of itself. And so, what structurally in your environment is preventing you from thinking long term may be a better way to go about it than just working on your own mind.
Mhm. It's good you mentioned about environment, because you have talked about a lot about setting up an appropriate environment if you are to do really well at investing, right? For example, just an idea of living away from the financial capital of financial cities, like you live in Zurich, Buffett lives in Omaha, and so many good investors out there who live away from, say, New York or London or Singapore, which are the financial hubs, right? So, can you please elaborate on the environment part, on what are those few things an investor can do to set the right
Yeah.
environment to be able to make sound, sensible investment decisions if they're not able to
Yeah.
change
And if
places, right?
some point I update my book or do something else, one of the first things I'd want to do is to correct something that I was very focused on at the time that I was writing the book, and I would be less focused on now. So, in the book, I spend a lot of time describing the physical environment. So, as you said, Vishal, being in Zurich, separating a reading room from a kind of busy slash work computer room, and I think that that's all extremely valid. And I don't want to detract from any of those things, except to say that even way more powerful, I think, than all of those things, or as powerful, not to be discounted, or certainly not to be not considered, is the relationships that you're in and the way those relationships are structured. So, there are plenty of day traders in Zurich. And if it doesn't matter how wonderfully long term Switzerland is, beautiful, rule of law, and nothing changes, and relationships are set by an agreement, verbal agreement, or as good as a contract written in blood. None of that will change if you're a trader on the trading floor of Credit Suisse or UBS. Then you're and so and that goes in all sorts of subtle ways as well. So I really do believe that part of, if I have any capacity to think long term, part of it is simply that I attend the Berkshire Hathaway meeting every year, and so I'm more likely to be in relationship with people who are thinking more long term. And so um, what I would want to do now is, rather than get into the minutiae of where my Bloomberg monitor is, or what my library looks at like, is who am I in a relationship with? When I say relationship, it's not just it's who are my investors, who is my accounting firm, who is my audit firm. Are they, within the audit firm, is it the partner who's got the best long-term perspective? And then over and above that, it's in the structuring of the relationship with the client. So in my case, we have moved progressively from share to share classes that give an enormous, a very, very good deal to the investor, in that they barely pay any fees at all. They don't pay no fees and only an incentive fee, but they tie their money up with me for a significant period of time. And so it's structured into the legal relationship as well. And I'm constantly thinking, as I think many people in my shoes are, how do I convert that situation to permanent capital, which is the best place to be? So, but just to reiterate, I would focus on, and I don't think that one shows up to a close investor, friend, accountant, lawyer, and say, "Hey, I've just figured out you're a short-term thinker. I'm kicking you out of my life." It's just that you want to hold those people a little bit more distant, and when you identify people who are thinking in a long-term way, hold them a little bit closer, if you like.
I think it's so important. I think you mentioned about the power of relationships rather than a physical environment, which really helps you as an investor. I think it goes so well with the idea of inner scorecard versus outer scorecard that Buffett talks about. Right? It's the war within, right? It's the kind of behavior that you yourself portray, or you yourself practice, that matters more than where you actually physically are. I think that's such an important
Yeah.
idea that you just talked about. So
I mean, I think another way of thinking about it is, that I like to think about it, way of thinking about it is, um, how are you taking care of your future self? So, what are you doing today for your future self? And there are plenty of things that we can do to take care of ourselves for right now. For some people, that might be to go running, might go out with a friend. Some people might do a hit of drugs, or they might smoke a cigarette. And so, and then but how are you taking care of yourself for the guy? How do I take care of the Guy Spier who's going to be around in 5 years, or in 10 years, or in 15 years? I think the happiest lives are lived when we don't. I mean, I know I have no more than one person who lives not in the present. They're constantly taking care of their future selves, and they're quite miserable in the present. But boy, the future's looking bright. Whether they're studying for exams, or saving too much money, or denying themselves daily pleasures of one kind or another. The other end of the spectrum is where you only take care of your current self and not your future self. And the best is when you're taking care of both. But so an awareness of, as I'm doing this, how does this make the Guy Spier of 5 years future happier, or more powerful, or richer, or better off in one way or another? And a constant awareness of that, I think, has helped me to kind of consider long-term factors, if you like. And there's something really amazing that happens, Vishal, so some investments take a short while to pay off, some investments take a very long while to pay off. But if you can get to a place where you're continuing to make investments into the future, but you're reaping the benefit of past investments today, and those benefits from past investments make me more incentivized to reach into future invest or to invest for the future. And so, for example, just to get into specifics of investing, so this is very, very practical and very specific, but I'm sure, Vishal, that you read conference calls from time to time. So now what I do when I read the conference calls is that if somebody's made a smart comment or may asked a good question, I'll reach out to them on LinkedIn and tell them that I like their question and appreciate them. And the simple reason, first of all, it's a nice thing to do in the present, but I'm also doing it because I know that at some point I may well have questions about that company. And there's no guarantee, but if they've asked an astute question on the conference call, then it's quite likely that they'll know about the company and they might be willing to entertain a conversation with me in the future. And so I make that investment today in the person, even though there's nothing specific that they can do for me, because sometime in the future, I might try and reach out and it would be nice if they responded. So that's a kind of like very small, minor investment, if you like.
So, Guy, you are a firm believer in the power of checklists and how they can help us become better at decision making, including investment decision making. Now, when you combine this idea with that of Warren Buffett calling Charlie Munger the best 30-second mind he has ever seen, what would your 30-second investment checklist look like? I mean, what would you look at in a business if all you have are just, say, 30 seconds, or let me give you 5 minutes? That would help you make up your mind either way.
So for the audience, with the fun that I get, because Vishal is so nice, and also I get to answer the question the way I want to answer it. And so what I want to do is not directly answer the question, but Vishal, if you come back to me, I will do my best to answer the question directly. But what has come up for me most strongly in recent times is that I used to look for businesses that had high margins, high returns. That was a sign of a quote, good business. Now I feel I'm looking for something different. And my father was just hospitalized for a while because he had a joint infection. I didn't realize how powerful bacteria are inside our bodies. And forgive me, this is a complete non sequitur, but it's like a health thing, really, really important. If you have a pain in your joint and you haven't been injured through some kind of sporting activity, what you need to be aware of is, or what you need to ask the doctor or the person in the emergency room is, have you ruled out joint infection? Because joint infection is a medical emergency. Your joint can get very severely and permanently damaged if you don't deal with a joint infection very, very quickly. Why do I bring that up in the context of investing? Because I started thinking of this idea that, a good investment. So the bacteria are very hard to get out of the body once they're there. And they spread. I mean, it's very dangerous if it goes into the blood. The bacteria can spread to other parts of the body, and they will infect the parts that have the least circulation. So the body has a hard time getting to where the bacteria are, and then they hang out and have a field day in places like bones or in the synovial fluid of a joint. Forgive me, I'm not a doctor, and I learned more about medicine than I ever wanted to learn. I asked myself, actually, you want to invest in businesses that are a bit like bacteria. And so the idea there is that, there are trees that grow tall, there are lions, there are big animals, elephants, and then there are kind of like, there's biomass that you don't even see because it's invisible, but it's there and it's metabolizing and it's growing. And so businesses where there's not something that, like, there's not huge profit margins to see, or there's not a high ROE, or there's not not a lot of song and dance, but they're quietly spreading through the economy and becoming a more and more significant part of the economy without anybody really ever noticing, if you like. And I think that there are some distribution businesses like that. What am I trying to say? Just to go back, try to get a little closer to your original question, is that I used to look for highly profitable businesses as a sign that people were doing things right. And now I actually believe that a more successful way to invest is not to look for the most profitable businesses. Those most profitable businesses often present a target for competition. Other people want to, as Jeff Bezos says, your margin is my opportunity. And to look for businesses that are maybe voluntarily reducing their profits in order to get things right. So the famous example would be Costco, but also, in the United States, which is the market that I look at most frequently, there are companies like Sherwin-Williams that does paints that doesn't look as if it's particularly profitable, but it's quietly growing, perhaps even like a bacteria. And a business that I've talked about a lot that's not cheap is this company, Pool Corporation, where the bacteria is this kind of it's just they're the best place, or often the best place, through which to distribute consumables for swimming pools. So uh, I've not answered your 5-minute checklist other than to say maybe it's not the most profitable businesses that I'm interested in. And and what happened? Just I'm following 3 different threads at once. Poor Vishal's wondering how the hell he's going to make sense of this for the listener, or do a segue to the next question. But I was there with one of the doctors talking about eradicating this bacteria from my father's ankle, and there's a there are operations, like I have an operation on my arm. I had an operation on my arm, and they explained to me that you cannot introduce any metal into a joint, which is often done to kind of help with older joints, because the bacteria find a way to live as a thin film on the metal, and then it is impossible to eradicate the bacteria from the human body other than removing. So joint replacements and things like that can get covered with bacteria. And in a bodily sense, you really don't want that. But in a business sense, that's freaking awesome if you can find businesses like that. So, um, and just to go back and actually try and answer your question, the 5-minute checklist. I mean, I think, Vishal, the reason why it's hard to answer that question is that the whole point of the checklist is that it's not automatic. What we're trying to do is interrupt automatic thought. It's trying to interrupt conclusions that we jump to without going through the various steps. And it sort of like asks things that says, well, is that the right conclusion to draw from this set of facts? And so I don't think there's such a thing as a 5-minute checklist. A 5-minute checklist is more like a hunch. And the checklist is actually designed to interrupt those thought processes. So there's my best attempt at an answer. And now back to you, Vishal.
Sure. So my next question is about the idea of moats, right? Even of some businesses described as inevitables by like Buffett and Munger, right? So those moats have narrowed over the years. We've seen the kind of disruption that businesses have faced across the world. Right now, when it comes to picking up stocks, you have focused a lot on the steady compounders, and my question is around the kind of investor I know you as, right? And I'm sure you've evolved, like the things you're talking about, right? So you can definitely throw some light over there, right? But as far as I know, you've focused a lot on the steady compounders, the inevitables like Nestle and Berkshire, and have done really well at that. But given again that the world is changing around us, and given the advances in technology and everything, right, what they might do to established companies, how do you assess those risks to the entire idea of investing and staying put in long term compounders? So how has your thinking changed over there?
You know what? One thing that Jeff Bezos said around, I don't know where he said it, but he certainly, I think, probably run Amazon in that way, is in a world where everything is changing, focus on the things that are not changing. And so there are many things that are changing, but what's not changing is that people value their time. People don't want to spend time doing things that they don't like doing, and so anything that saves people time, for example. So um, just because everything is changing, or it feels like everything's changing, there are some things that are remaining stationary, and those things might be worth focusing on. In particular, when it comes to, and look, the whole the stock market, the media, they all want to sell eyeballs. They're trying to get attention, and we focus on things that are changing. It's the way, that the retina, the cells in the back of our eyes. The only reason why we see something is that the eye is constantly moving. And if you create a situation where a line is stationary, or a boundary is stationary on the retina and the eye, you stop detecting it. The only reason why the human body detects things is if they're moving. And so people are trying to get other people's attention, amplify that. But if you actually start trying to focus on things that are not changing. There's an awful lot that's not changing. Um, uh, in a restaurant, it's a, pretty well understood that the consumer is more likely to pick a branded water than a non-branded water if the cost of the water is not significant to them, because the water might taste exactly the same. But and even in Switzerland, where the water supply is, I saw somewhere where Switzerland is called the water fortress, the Fort Knox of water for Europe. It's got more water than any other country in Europe because it's got the mountains and all the rainfalls there, and it's tied up in the glaciers and things. And water's extraordinarily fresh, but a consumer will take a branded water even in a Swiss restaurant, even when they can be confident that the water coming out of the tap is fresh. That's what people do. And if you're a supplier of the kinds of brands that people reach for kind of a sense of security, you're putting something in your mouth, you want to know what you're putting in there, then that's not changing. And there are all sorts of things that are not changing in that way. And I think, I think that I'm focusing in those areas, but then at the same time, there may be some innovation that is well established enough and is not going to change for an extremely long time. And I think that maybe Warren's investment in Apple is a bit like that. I am very angry at myself. I heard about Apple, a very smart guy, thoughtful guy who lives on an island in Wisconsin, outside of Madison. I won't mention his name because he's a very private person. I just remember him talking to me about Apple, and he was just saying, he was focusing in a certain way. He was focusing on things that were not changing. He was saying, look, humans like images more than they like written text, and they like moving images more than they like written text. And if you look at the Windows ecosystem, it's not very good with images. If you look at the Apple ecosystem, it's all about images. And so this was about 2005. He probably put about 5 or 10% of his portfolio into Apple, and he's never looked back, I guess. So there are plenty of things, and I think that another thing that's not changing is that, well, I find it interesting. I was thinking about Intercontinental Exchange, which is a U.S. exchange business, extraordinarily well run, and it's not so. So people over time, contracts get standardized, and over time, the venues where those contracts get traded and the venues where they get settled get standardized. And I'm not just talking about stocks and shares. I'm talking about all sorts of commodities. And if you can find somebody who's really good at making that happen, that's something that's not changing. So, and I also find it interesting to just take two technological developments. I mean, one is the credit card networks, and there's been a kind of a secular growth in credit cards that has just been creeping up every year, year after year after year after year after year. And we're aware that the volume of transactions that is handled over credit cards far exceeds probably all of the crypto networks put together. I mean, it's an extraordinarily efficient means of organizing payment transfers in a retail setting. Not maybe the most efficient that one could come up with from scratch, but it's a change that happened when credit card networks started, and it's continuing to work its way through the economy. Another place where I remember seeing this, which was really interesting to me, was in cable subscriptions. So just simply houses that decide that they want to be hooked up via a fixed connection to data, and that probably is, well, it's not a natural monopoly, and it's not a business that I'm invested in. But so there are plenty of one thing is what's not changing, but maybe you can get onto the wave of change. I think that when investors like me get onto the wave of change, it's a wave that's moving at a reasonable speed. It's not moving too fast. The wave is moving too fast, you're too late to catch it. And once you finally figured it out, the wave's already passed. You want these kind of slow building waves over decades, basically. Another, forgive me, I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but over my investing lifetime, I think that probably at the time that I started investing in the United States, there were more than 14,000 individual banks. And today, I believe, and it's not a number that I look at on a daily basis for sure, even on an annual basis, the number of banks is now below 10,000. So there's this clear long term secular trend towards consolidation in the US banking industry. And there are all sorts of reasons for that: brand economies, technological economies. And you look at the very mature British banking market, and there's like 4 or 5 banks. And even at the behest of the Bank of England, retail banks, even at the behest of Bank of England, when this company Metro Bank launched, and I don't know if it was at the behest, but based on conversations, there was support for the launch of that bank in the UK. They have a hard time breaking into that market. And it's not that they don't have, it's not that they're not good people and it's not efficient. It's that it's hard work attracting all sorts of resources that the existing banks have already dominated. So we might end up with a market in the United States which is as concentrated as as the UK in terms of retail banking. And then banks like J.P. Morgan will have a balance sheet that's well, it might not be 10 times larger. It might be 3 or 4 times larger than it is today. But JP Morgan already has last time I looked, it was a $2 trillion more balance sheet. That's a very, very large balance sheet. So thank you for nodding so patiently as I give a non-answer to your question.
I think that helps explain the point that you're trying to make. Uh, uh, Coming on from the response that you just gave about growth and changes, and things that are happening, and focusing on things that are not going to change, which are much more stable over a long period of time. You've been an investor in India in the past, right? So how do you look at the opportunity that India presents to the world at this point of time as an investor? So what are the good
Yeah,
things that you like about India over a long term? What are the things that you
yeah.
don't like about India as an investment opportunity?
Um, so yeah, it's a great question. It's a fun question. So I've been reading things recently. I don't want to make this a political discussion, but people are very, very concerned about the rise of illiberalism and everywhere in the world, and they're also concerned about the rise of illiberalism in India, where somebody, the party that leads or the prime minister, kind of like is for one group but not for another group. And I find it hard to believe that that is the case or that it will stick, even if it is the case, because my experience of India is that it's, I was going to say by far and away the most diverse place on the planet. I don't know if that's it. I was struck by the extraordinary diversity of religion, culture, appearance in any major city in India. Is just, you could live your whole life in India and discover 20 new religions you'd never even heard of, which is just it's kind of an extraordinary place like that. And I find it really fascinating how many elements of identity overlap. So you could be Jain and you could be Marwari, or you could be Jain, you could be Gujarati or Punjabi. And so there are all these kind of like multiple layers of identity that intermix, which I think makes it an extraordinarily rich place. Um, I think that the English language overlay over India may end up being one of the, viewed by some at least, if not many, as an extraordinary gift that was inadvertently given to India, because it means that India shows up to the global competition for resources, growth, competitiveness with an extraordinary advantage, in that for most Indians, at least English is not a third language. For a large number of Indians, it's the language of instruction. And so that gives in India as an economy an extraordinary edge over other large economies where it's not a language of instruction ever. Interestingly enough, my parents, one of the reasons why they wanted me to study in English was because they knew that English was going to be the global language. So I think that India sits in this interesting place in the middle of, China's name is the Middle Kingdom, but at least the way I see the way gross domestic product is distributed around the planet, if you're trying to find a center of gravity for which location is the closest to everybody else when weighted by GDP or GNP per capita, I think that India probably comes pretty close. I think maybe the closest is Emirates terminal in Dubai, which seems to be the center of the known universe. But I think that so India for me as a developing market was far easier to engage with because in the vast majority of cases, any significant corporation produces reports in English, and that makes it possible for me to read it. And I also think that the fact that so many back office processing businesses have been located in India, there's a kind of a, an education process happening across the Indian population where large numbers of Indians in call centers are talking to people in English, usually in the developed world, and are learning processes and learning attitudes. And many of those conversations are client relationship, taking care of a client in a developed country. But I think that even just in that process, there's enormous learning that takes place. And the fact that if you have English language, you have access to the largest portion of the internet, which is in English, and you have access to all sorts of videos, instruction materials, magazines, writings. So there's a kind of like a very fast process. I was just reading up a few things on Wikipedia today and realizing that 20 years ago, or before Wikipedia, I would have had to go to the library and check out a book to learn the inside scoop on the City of London and the very unique governance structures that the City of London has, for example. So India is just in this phenomenal place. When I first went to India, it was in around 2003. I had made an investment in the leading credit rating company of India, CRISIL, and I think that India's changed vastly since then. And I know that these are kind of like personal anecdotes, but I think that there's significance there. My experience of India at the time was more in the direction of memories of the British Raj, if you like. And my the if I could sort of like summarize the impression, it's I'm sitting with somebody who is either a current or former government official, and it's in a colony, as you call it, and there's a clock ticking, and there's a fan overhead, and everything is moving extraordinarily slowly. And maybe after you know 45 minutes of greeting pleasantries, somebody brings some tea, and the whole meeting's lasted 3 hours, and four things were said. And the most important thing is that my experience of Indians talking about India was that it was this sense of nothing is ever going to change, and this is what it is, and get used to it. Whereas my experience on more recent trips to India is that there's everybody speaks with a sense of confidence that one way or another, India will find a way to solve its problems. And you see that whether I think of the most recent time I flew out of Mumbai, and there's this beautiful new airport there, or the fact that roads have been constructed, highways are constructed. Yes, it seems like every highway that's created, you then get a bunch of people walking down it in the opposite direction, not the way it was intended to be used. But that's part of India's color, but it's still moving in the right direction. And the imposition of the general sales tax, for example, was an extraordinary thing when you stop and think about it. And it's something that people like myself, I mean, we don't realize that actually India is a less integrated economy than the European Union, and the fights that there are in the European Union to standardize certain things are nothing in comparison to the difficulties that India has. So I just think that all bodes extraordinarily positively for India. And I feel very confident that the nature of India is that it will end up being part of the free world. I think a lot of my friends, for your interest right now, Vishal, have a lot of question marks around why India does not play. India's not when it comes to this conflagration between Russia and Ukraine. India's kind of like the American friends are like, why is India not on America's side? And there are all sorts of historical reasons for it that I explain to my friends. But I think that the path of India is into an ever closer relationship with the parts of the world that free. That's the natural place for India to be. So that's a long sort of prologue, but I have an enormous number of positive things to say about India. The problems are enormous. I mean, how much fraud exists in India? An enormous amount. How much fraud will be exist in the future in India? An enormous amount, but hopefully less than there is today, or at least a smaller proportion of GDP than there is today. Warren Buffett has this statement: "It's hard for a empty sack to stand straight." India's coming from, you turn the clock back to the independence, and there was an enormous amount of poverty, and poverty breeds all sorts of things that one should be forgiving of. I think that when it comes to my investing in India, you and others like you and Monish have a big advantage over me in that I approach investing in India with the extreme knowledge, and hopefully I never forget it, that I am an outsider. I didn't grow up in the country. I can't speak Hindi. I don't understand the subtleties. And so I think that somebody like me has to restrict myself to a very, very small number of businesses. In general, I like to stick with businesses that have multiple regulators looking at them, that are highly regulated or in a certain way very much in the public eye, because I think that reduces the probability of any kind of I would not even want to say fraud, but just not ideal behavior, if you like. I think that if, one friend that I traveled in India with one year had me meet a guy from one of the big four accounting firms who kind of did an analysis of Indian publicly traded companies based on who their accounting firms were. So some accounting firms are more likely to be willing to collaborate in your fraudulent scheme than others. And so he was looking at doing small cap investing in India. First of all, doing a screen by who's your auditor, knowing which are the auditors that are above board, which ones aren't, and kind of cutting out all the ones that are not worth having as your auditor if you're a public company. I think that that's really interesting and valuable work that somebody who's investing locally in India can do, that unless I was going to go and live in Mumbai and spend the next 20 years, and even then, I don't think I'd do particularly well at that. So there's a certain justice there as well. It means that outside, sort of like foreign capital like mine, can't invest in every opportunity, but local capital can, and that's the way it should be. The local capital should have better opportunities than foreign capital, and it does. Um, so yeah, I really enjoy saying this, so I'm going to say it again. I I don't see why it should not happen that at the point at which India is the largest economy in the world, the largest English speaking economy in the world, which, unless the United States somehow quadruples its population, is going to be the case at some point. So if incomes per capita are going to rise in India, which they certainly will, where they only have to be, I mean, India's population is around 1.4 billion, I believe. United States is between 300 and 400 million. So India's per capita income, just very roughly, only has to be at a quarter of what the United States is for it to be at parity with the US economy. And it could be 4 times larger than the US economy. And I think that when that happens, there will be more and more things about how the world economy runs that actually will be decided in India. So I can imagine, and it may not happen in my lifetime, but I can imagine that in the same way many of us flock to the United States to do an MBA or for further study, not just because the universities are great, but also because that's where best practice is to be found. And if it's not where best practice is to be found, it is where the people who are deciding how it will be are to be found. So, internationally accepted accounting principles are decided by a bunch of Anglo-Saxon educated accountants. And so if you want to be a really, really good accountant, you have to familiarize yourself with their thinking. And so why is it not possible that in some time in the not so distant future, people will actually travel to India because there'll be many things that are de facto decided by the Indian population because it's the largest economy in the English speaking world, at least. And so I think that sort of behooves all of us to pay closer attention to what's going on in India, and I'm glad that I'm doing that. I'm also glad that many Indians. I mean, I think that I care less to read about Ambani's getting rich than middle class Indians getting rich. I think the size of the Indian middle class is, last time I looked at the number, was about 60 million middle class and richer Indians. And it's a big number. That's about the size of a medium sized European country. But let's get to a place where half the Indian population is middle class and nobody's on the poverty line. There's an enormous amount of work to do there. Very last thing, because as you can see, I can go on and on. Yeah, I find it's really fun. I mean, do I miss going to Nariman Point in Mumbai? Yes, but uh, BKC complex works extraordinarily well. So India's solving problems. I think that uh, I was shocked and sort of like um, angry at myself for thinking it. I used to visit. I lived in Israel for a while, and there was a certain point in Israel's history where it had no shopping malls. You just had these strips of outside stores, and in summertime, Israel gets very hot. And I just thought, yeah, well, that's the way it works in Israel, and it's kind of cute for what it goes. And then I remember going the first time I went into a shopping mall in India, sorry, in Israel, and just being angry at myself and thinking, why did you have such uh, poor expectations of Israel that they would not enjoy, the Israelis would not enjoy air conditioned shopping malls with convenient parking. And I remember that when I first went into an air conditioned shopping mall in India, I felt the same. I was reminded of that thought about Israel because guess what? You know, Indians like air conditioned apartments. They like nice views. They like hallelujah. Indians are human, and that stuff is happening, which is just amazing to see. I mean, and so yeah, it's an exciting place to be.
Great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts as an outsider. And definitely, all with all its complexities and problems that we've had the past many decades, India is changing for the better. So it's in gradual spurts. We're faltering at certain places, we're rising at certain places, but yeah, definitely on the right path. So,
Yeah,
but it's great to hear
I
your thoughts over there.
actually I feel like I want to. It's a. I guess it's a little bit of a plug, but I'm going to enjoy making it here, and I really do believe what I'm about to say is that. So yes, I have part of my focus on the ratings industry in India is that because it's a highly regulated industry, because the ratings agencies are dealing with issuers who themselves are regulated, I think that there's again, it's more likely to be a safe place for me to invest. That's no guarantees in life, but um, and I don't fault anyone in India for the fact that India's three of India's rating agencies are controlled out of companies whose headquarters are in the northeast of the United States. I mean, Moody's, Standard and Poor's, and Fitch used to be controlled out of Paris, but it is all now also in the United States. And so the largest homegrown ratings agency that is not foreign controlled is Care Ratings. And Care Ratings has a long way to go to have global standards, and so there's a lot of low hanging fruit there. I recently had contact with the CEO, and I think that he's very much seized of the work, and there's a lot of work to be done. But I want to appeal to an Indian sense of patriotism and Indian pride, and put this thought into at least your head, Vishal, and maybe you'll respond to my thought, or maybe a listener will respond to my thought. It would be a continuation of colonialism if the only countries that are rating Indian debt are controlled from Washington. So why on earth? So if India is going to emerge as a world leading economy, perhaps the largest English speaking economy in the world, are its Indian corporations still going to kowtow to standards and procedures set by the old colonial masters in New York in this case? And I'm being slightly provocative, but I think there's an element of truth there. And I ask myself, if I'm an African issuer from Angola or from Nigeria or from I'm Indonesian company, and now I've got rating standards that are being set by Moody's, Standard and Poor's, and Fitch out of New York. And I ask myself, actually, I'd like one of those companies to rate me, and I want somebody who's not from that old colonial powers. Forgive me, I'm using emotive language because I want to be emotive, and I realize the United States didn't colonize England. Didn't colonize India. It was the UK that colonized it. But you know what? They're all white men. So and I think that I'd like to suggest that the companies like I'm blanking the Infosys, for example, Tata Group, these globalized companies that are highly trusted brands globally, where the Brits trusted Tata enough that they were willing to sell valuable brands like Land Rover to be manufactured by Tata, and the royal family and people in the British government still drive Range Rovers and Rovers as if they're British cars, and they're probably manufactured in the UK, but they're so um, do so there has to be at some point a globalization of Indian finance. And I think that it would be hard for Indian finance to globalize the way Tata have or Infosys or other global Indian companies if there isn't a homegrown Indian rating agency. And so that's my little plug. But in a certain way, I think that there's a future in which, it won't be that Mahatma Gandhi was going. Why did Mahatma Gandhi go to the UK to study law? It was the center of power. Of course, if you were interested in power, if you were interested in being the most effective lawyer, you would go to the UK. And why, in part, did people like me go to study in the United States? Because it is a center of power, it's the center of it's where things get decided. In the future, there'll be people who travel to India to get their MBAs in India. There'll be lawyers who travel to India to study Indian law. There'll be people who'd go to School of Government because they want to be closer to the Indian government and how the Indian government does something. And I think it's not too soon to start saying, well, how is India preparing for that? How are Indian institutions preparing for that? Now, India's got a lot of local problems to solve. But actually, if I stop and think about it, already, if I think of Aravind eye clinics, for example, or other solutions that have come out of the medical world, where the only thing that in the developed world that we had in our minds were very, very expensive solutions to problems that were very capital and human intensive. And then inventive people in India figure out a very inexpensive way to do something or a far higher quality way of doing something. So, India should be more prepared for that because problems that India is solving today already are getting globalized, and India will end up being a global power. I think that's, and I've rambled all over the place. I think that is an extraordinary positive for the world, an extraordinary positive, because uh, my experience of India is that it is written into the political. Yes, there have been riots and there have been terrible, deaths in India through sectarian disputes. But basically, that I think that the overwhelming majority of Indians understand that the way to go is to solve your disputes not by force. And I think that has the capacity to be a very, very responsible player in the world of international affairs, and that the natural instincts, political instincts that Indians will bring to global problems will make a positive contribution.
Uh, I want to touch upon your book, The Education of a Value Investor. I've highly recommended that book to so many people out there, and it's a wonderful book that really never loses its charm. I've read that probably multiple times. In chapter 10 of your book, where you talk about your own process of investing, you've actually laid out 10 rules, 10 personal investing, or sorry, 8 personal investing rules, right? Which has really served you well. For the benefit of the audience, let me just quickly read out those rules. Number one, stop checking stock price. Two, if someone tries to sell you something, don't buy it. Number three, don't talk to management. Number four, gather investment research in the right order. Number five, discuss your investment ideas only with people who have no axe to grind. Number six, never buy or sell stocks when the market is open. Seven, if a stock tumbles after you buy it, don't sell it for 2 years. Number eight, don't talk about your current investments. I would suggest the listeners to go on and read your book to understand your explanation for each of these rules. But your book came out in 2014, 8 years have passed. Are there any more rules that you've added to your toolbox?
I was saying, propose something else that, around building one's environment. I think that I would write that chapter very, very differently today. And when I give talks, I kind of say, I tell people, look, you've read my book, so you're expecting the person who wrote the book to show up in front of you, except I'm not that person. I'm somebody who's evolved for 8 years since then. The thing that strikes me the most that I is really, really important to share with you is the idea of not speaking to management is a very bad idea. It's an understandable idea, and so the example that I've used in other circumstances is a chainsaw is a very dangerous tool. If you mishandled a chainsaw, it could easily slice through a limb, in no time at all. So, the famous movie title in the US called Chainsaw Massacre, and I haven't watched the movie, but it's pretty gory, I understand, and you don't want to be very careful around a chainsaw. But excuse me. But if you're charged with cutting down a forest worth of trees, you don't want to be walking around with a penknife. It's not going to help you very much. You really do need a chainsaw. So it's a very dangerous tool, but it's a very, very useful tool. It's a useful tool if handled right. And I think that talking to management should be considered in the same way. So in the worst circumstances, which I describe in the book, you're going to end up getting a very one-sided story through speaking to the management. But you're really dumb if you don't, because you can get all sorts of insights, tells, opportunities to learn, relationships. So not talking to management is not the right response. Understandable. The right response is handle with care, handle very carefully. It's a very, very dangerous tool. Don't treat it lightly. All the things that I've said about the way management is selected to make bad situations look good are true. But that doesn't mean you don't talk to them in the same way that if you have to cut down a forest of trees, you're going to pick up the chainsaw, but damn well learn how to use it beforehand. So in terms of, I think that I think that one wants to take any particular action, heuristic, habit, and realize, the name of your show is 1% Better. It actually describes it perfectly. All we need to do is get 1% better. And if we do that consistently, the results are going to be extraordinary. So we can take any particular action that we do and say, if I amplify this out all the way until the end of time, is this going to make a contribution or not? And I think there are none that coming to mind other than those 8 rules. But I'm sure that there are plenty. You might have to kind of prompt me a little bit more specifically on the rules, I guess, or on the heuristics. I mean, what I'm giving there are heuristics. Yeah. My mind draws a blank because it's so fast. It's such a long time since I went over those rules. You might want to ask me about specific ones. The one that stood out for me is the one that I fundamentally disagree with. I mean, another one that I have drastically changed on is this idea of not speaking about your investments in public. So, not that I'm recommending to anybody to go on to, a major Indian TV channel or CNBC and start talking their book, I guess is what you call it. But I think that talking about your investments in the right forum with the right people is a very, very smart thing to do, because you will trigger reactions and responses that will help you to learn. So I actually, in my most recent meeting with my investors, I said, look, I know you guys have heard me say in public, don't talk about your investments. That's about me talking to a non-known and potentially infinitely sized group of an audience of a TV program or a podcast. But in specific environments, in this room, for example, and one-on-one, I'm happy to talk about investments. In fact, I think it's my obligation to, and I think that I may learn a lot from you. You're not nobodies. You're a bunch of smart people. So it's in my interest to talk about them, but in the right way. So, and I don't know if it's in the book, but the guy says, hey, Vishal, you should look at XYZ stock. I just bought some. It's going to go up tomorrow. You don't want to have conversations like that. What you want to have conversations with is, hey, Guy brought up this idea of thinking about companies like bacteria, invest in companies that feel and look like bacteria. I wonder if you can come up with any. What do you think of this one? Those are all interesting conversations to have. So,
Wonderful. So, Guy, we're nearing the end of the conversation. I have just a few more questions and non-investing anymore. I
yeah.
want to close this conversation with non-investing stuff and more, I think, ideas that are going to help probably a wider span of people than just investors. My first question is about your role as a parent, right? You have three kids, and I'm sure you are fairly experienced in this job of being a parent as well. So, what's your idea of parenting? Fun. And second is, what are those key lessons that you have passed on to your kids that you wish they practice as they grow up to live good and happy lives?
Yeah, and for your interest, thank you, Vishal. So we had a short interruption there. So he's asked the question again, and so it's given me a little more time to answer it. And then that in the few moments I learned when the question was asked previously that Vishal has two children. One is a teenager, and one is not yet a teenager. And I think that my experience of parenting is that any lessons that you think that you've learned as a parent or any knowledge that you may have as a parent of non-teenage children gets thrown out the window when they become teenagers. It's a kind of a crisis, at least was a crisis in our family of parenting, because the children start becoming adults. And there's a comedian, someone who said it, that all the way up to about age uh, pre-teenage years, early, sort of like age 10, well, ages 11, 12, 13, the children are kind of like fully formed children, and they can take care of themselves, and maybe they'll even be polite. And then when they become teenagers, all hell breaks loose, because there's this transition to adulthood, and they start rejecting everything that the parents have to offer, reject home. They're only interested in their friends. They start wanting to do things that make the parents just go, why do you want to do that? That seems utterly crazy. That's not what I brought you into the world to do. And so it's an extraordinarily challenging time for parents. And I don't know, and my wife has been the one who's been more heavily involved with the children, but I've never seen my wife more challenged, and I've never more challenged in ways that I never would have expected. And so my wife used to give parenting classes, but ever since we had teenage children, she wouldn't go anywhere near a parenting class, because she really feels like she doesn't have any particular authority, because it's such a challenging experience having teenagers. So my confidence as well in that regard has been dented. Um, but on the other side, I think that with children before teenagers, and especially when they're young, there's a kind of opportunities to kind of indoctrinate them in really subtle ways that hopefully will carry through to adulthood. I don't know if that will turn out to have been a successful endeavor for us, but uh, you know, so now I'm not giving prescriptions as to what to do. I'm saying some of the things that we've done, and check in 5 years' time and see if they worked out. I feel very fortunate that my wife, as a Mexican woman, very, very focused on family meals. There's a lot of evidence that uh, people who grew up in a household with two parents where there were family meals have so much more of an advantage in life than just about anything else that you can do. And so I think that now that I have teenage children who are all in boarding schools, I really miss those family meals, and I cherish them when we get the opportunity to have them. But our children are increasingly under their own steam and independent, and so it's their choice whether they join the family meals or not, and they often have more interesting things to do. But I think that around family meals, when the children don't have the choice, which have a clear beginning, middle, and an end, is gives the opportunity to learn conversation, and there's all sorts of things that the child brings up by osmosis. And this was not the way in the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, for example, where children were to be seen but not heard, and they often sat and dined at separate tables. And I think that the, the Mexican mother of my wife, we would have family meals, and we would often have guests at the table. And I've heard my children talk about how having guests at the table was an opportunity for them to learn. So that's something that we've done that I hope somehow has had some benefits for our children. I'm a huge believer in the power of books to transform. I'm a huge believer in the power of having an anti-library. So it's not about, well, it's good to have read a lot of books, but it's also very good to own a lot of books that you have not read, or in the absence of an anti-library in your own home, to be regularly in libraries, which have vast and broad collection of books. I'm a huge believer in the power of serendipity. So books for me are way more than something to read or something to be entertained by. They're thinking machines. Each book is the contents of somebody's mind and soul that is being poured onto those pages. And I have access to that person's mind or to reflection of that person's mind. What's that got to do with children is that we have a rule that, we would never deny our children any book that they wanted to buy. We would always deny them toys and games, but any book was an automatic yes. It didn't matter what the book was. So long as they were interested in us buying it, we would buy them that book. So, I hope that has a payoff. I don't know how it will have a payoff. And like I said, I'm in the middle of the teenage years, so we will discover whether it has a payoff or not. There's a book that my wife used to teach from, whose the name of the author it does not come to my mind, but it's the title is How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, How to Listen So Kids Will Talk. Uh, Again, it's much easier to apply all of those lessons with pre-teenage children than post-teenage children, but more generally, when it comes to family relationships, I think that when my wife and I were not long married, we started doing marital counseling because our relationship was going so badly, and we went to something. So I'm going to give you another book, Vishal. It was something called Imago Therapy and the book is by a man called Harville Hendrix, and it's called. There's two: Keeping the Love You Find and Finding You. The author is Harville Hendrix. One of the skills that we learn there is this something called active listening, which is well understood by people who are negotiators and by people who are mediators and by many people in the therapy profession. But the capacity to make somebody feel understood, or at least to know what steps to take to get there, seems to me to be absolutely key in one's relationship to one's children. I guess I have a couple of more points that have just been brought up. So the one thing that I've learned, I finally came up with this formulation for one of my teenage children. So if you're listening to this and you have teenage children, I just want you to know that I'm sorry. And my heart goes out to you because I know that it's really tough. But, I came to a formulation where I said to one of my children, look, I'm your father. I'm responsible for your presence on the planet. I will always be your father. I will always love you. And, there's a but coming in case you couldn't tell. Then I added, and I said, so that is a given and that you can count on to the rest of time. And then I said, but my respect and my friendship does not come automatically. That has to be earned. So if you want me to respect you, you want me to be your friend, that has to be earned, and that is earned through your actions, through what you do, through your choices. And I said, by the way, it's the same for you to me. I expect you to honor me as your father and to treat me with the respect that a father deserves, but to have your friendship, yeah, and to have your respect beyond the narrow circumstances of fatherhood in a broader sense, for you to respect me not just as your father, but as a human being, as an individual, as a businessman, as an investor, I said that I have to earn from you. That is not granted. That is not a given. And I'll do everything I can to earn that from you. But I know that I can't expect it by matter of right, but neither can you expect those things from me. And I felt like that was a kind of a good balance between unconditional love, which is always there, but that doesn't mean, I love you as my child, I just don't respect you right now, or I love you as my child, but you are not my friend right now, was kind of a helpful formulation. So if you're a parent of teenage children, but the How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, How to Listen So Kids Will Talk, really, really good book. Harville Hendrix, Active Listening. which is all about trying to take the other person's perspective and to understand where they're coming from, just as we hope that they will understand. They'll take the effort to understand where we're coming from. I think it's been extraordinarily helpful.
That's a valuable lesson, Guy. Being father of a teenage daughter, as you rightly mentioned, I think I take that. So, final three questions for you, Guy, and I'll try and make it quick, right? The first two questions combined. What's the single best piece of advice you ever got? And what's the single worst piece of advice you ever got?
So yeah, I think that uh, it's a line from a play in Shakespeare, Hamlet. It's "To thine own self be true," and I think that whenever I've diverged from being true to myself is where I've run into the most problems. And when I've kind of looked inside myself in the face of uncertainty, and I think that the answer to so many questions of what should I do now? Then must we do? What then must I do now? When we have no answer, when the environment and the world is giving us no answer, then we have to look inside and say, who do I want to be in this moment of uncertainty? And I think that often there are very, very clear answers there. So, you know, is it to be a good friend? Is it to be a good father? Is it to be a loyal investor in this company? Is it to so to thine own self be true to yourself and answer the question, who do I want to be in this situation? And there's extraordinary power in that because when we know what we want to be, that gives a guide to action. It doesn't give a guarantee as to results, but it means that we can look back and know that we did what was right for us at the time. And that should at least allow for a life lived without regret. Um, the best, advice on what not to do. I mean, I think that in general, yeah, the thing that comes up for me is that, yeah, and I can tie it in very nicely for you, Vishal. So I was a student at Oxford University studying law, and I hated law, and I had this hunch that I needed to change subjects, which was not really something that was done. And I approached my now economics tutor in college and asked if I could change courses. And I had many people who told me not to do it. They said, "Oh, you're about to finish your law degree. Why give up now? You've just got another year, and then you'll be done." And their advice was wrong. I absolutely did the right thing. There's a part of me that would have died had I not changed subjects. And so many good things that flowed in my life, that happened in my life, flowed from that decision. So sometimes when we want to make an important move or a big move that internally feels right, there'll be people who come and try and stop you from doing it. I think that what we need to remember is that often the reason why they're trying to stop you, or the reason why those people were trying to stop me at the time, was not because they knew what was good for me, but because if I made that move, what did that mean for them? How did that challenge them? It made them deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes to lead for yourself or for others is to make people uncomfortable. And if you can identify that that's why they're telling you not to do it, it tells you more about them than it does about you. And interestingly enough, it was a question that I kind of asked Warren Buffett at the charity lunch that we had. And I asked him because it was so hard for me to switch to a zero management fee structure in my fund. And I said, and I wanted him to know that I'd basically changed it because I didn't want to show up at the lunch being the only guy who charges a management fee. And I said, does it get any easier? And he kind of, I think it's maybe in the book. And he kind of like thought for a bit and he said, yeah, probably a little. And so, and why does that come up for me? Because the time that I wanted to change the fee structure in the fund, there were many people who said, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Don't do it. And they had all sorts of reasons. So sometimes people, when you make a decision that is an important decision, there's some part of them that will feel threatened and will try and convince you not to do it. So the world is a treacherous place. I think I'll leave the listener and you with this thought. You're looking for answers. We're all looking for answers. But as Charlie Munger said, this isn't supposed to be easy. If it was, everybody else would be doing it. And, I gave this answer to somebody just recently. I said, look, and this is for you, Vishal, and anybody who's still managed to listen to this point. What are we actually trying to do, all of us in the 1% club, all of us investors? We actually want to do something that's extraordinarily arrogant. We want to sit around looking into monitors, writing emails, having conversations, talking to management, reading annual reports, thinking about the world. And somehow through that action, we want to go richer. And in a certain way, what we define as success is that we want to control a larger proportion of society's assets tomorrow than we did today. So we actually want to get more of the good stuff, not through building roads, houses, constructing things, inventing new technologies, but actually just through sitting and thinking. And it's actually remarkable that anybody can succeed at that, actually, because it's not the nature of things. The nature of a competitive world is things get competed away. And so all this stuff is supposed to be hard. By definition, not everybody can succeed. And, if you imagine that, let's just imagine for a second that the number of people, the amount of assets in the United States, just to define it very simply, let's just say that there's space for $500 billion of excess wealth. Well, Warren Buffett's, I don't know where he is right now, 150 billion for Warren, and 200 billion, well, last time I heard, for Elon Musk, and then a few others make it up to 500 billion. But imagine for a second that if Warren wasn't worth 150 billion, he was only worth 1 billion. That would be 149 other billionaires that could have been in that list, that have been kind of like, in the world that I've defined, have been edged out by Warren Buffett. There's a certain limit to the number of super rich people or even rich people. So what we're trying to do is something that is really, really hard, and we should respect that, and in fact, to be awed by the difficulty that is that we have in doing it, and kind of like be a little bit more humble about the results that we expect, as well as be a little bit more focused on the actions that we need to take, and accept that they're not going to work instantly or fast or necessarily extremely well, because the world is a competitive place. The actions that Walter Schloss took, friend of Warren Buffett's, holding a Geiger counter over net stocks, is different to what we have to do today. And just one short plug for your show, Vishal. I have no doubt, and I'm saying this not lightly, because of Vishal's mindset, if you simply listen to Vishal's podcasts, and if you simply tune in to Vishal, you're increasing the probability that you will successfully achieve that, in the same way that going to the Berkshire Hathaway meeting increases that probability. But those kinds of small actions help. So there are my closing comments, Vishal. I hope that's helpful.
That's really helpful, Guy, and thank you for the plug. Thank you for your kind words and for sharing your time with me, sharing all your insights that you have, wisdom that you
Yeah.
have. So just love it.
Well,
So thank you.
my pleasure, and I look forward to meeting you in person at the right opportunity, Vishal.
Same here, guys. Same here. Take care and have a nice day, Guy. Thank you so much.